Hello and welcome to part 2 of this little mini-series as I try and convert a Bach 50B3 bass trombone to a 50T3. Where we stand at the moment is that I have a lot of bits that have had most of the dents removed to make them usable, and we can now dry fit some of the bits together. One thing I've also done is taken the bell and I've put the old main brace back on the bell just to give me something to anchor towards. That is, of course, making the assumption that the brace goes in exactly the same position as it did before, an assumption that I have, after having a bit of play around, found is erroneous. See, I've ran into quite a big problem, quite a bit of a dilemma, and that is that these parts came from a Bach 50T3 that had been absolutely destroyed by British Airways. Now the idea of an airline ruining an instrument through careless handling is completely foreign and something the world has never heard of before, but alas, that is what's happened. And the consequence of that is that the bell was munched, the slide was munched, and one of the previous owners lopped off the valves and saved them until they sold them to me. But the problem is that there are a lot of subtle bends and things that are not quite in alignment, and I don't know which things are correct, which things are angled correctly, which things are angled incorrectly, things that are naturally bent, things that are accidentally bent, and so forth. One of the things I'll show you to demonstrate this is that if we get the first trigger and we get the second trigger and we pop them on top of each other as you would find in the instrument, well, this tube here that connects the first trigger with the second trigger squirts off at something of an angle, and the tube doesn't look bent, it doesn't look anything like anything particularly bad's come with it. It could have been designed like this, but it just looks wrong that it's bent at this sort of an angle, and as a result this face of the valve and this face of the second valve aren't parallel with each other, which upsets my rather aesthetical noticing eye. And as a consequence, if we look down the axis of the tubing here, it's not straight, it goes round something of an angle. Is that correct? Is this by design or is this by accident? I have absolutely no idea. Another thing that I've got as an example is this piece of tubing. This is part of the tuning slide for the F valve, is supposed to mate happily with this piece of tubing. However, this brace is a bit loose here, but if we stick these together, then they come together at a slight angle. I would expect this tubing to be parallel, but it isn't parallel. One of these braces has been compressed, or perhaps both of them have been compressed, but by different amounts. So it's really difficult to know what's supposed to be in one particular configuration and what is accidentally in the particular configuration that I see it. So but there are a few things that I've concluded. The first thing is that these triggers may be bent accidentally, but I'm not going to risk straightening them up because the valves actually work. I did some work. Some liquid flew out of that. I did some work on just getting the first valve working just perfectly, and I don't want to risk messing that up by fiddling around with this tube coming out of the first valve. So I'm going to attack this a little bit like a Sudoku puzzle. I'm going to find out what things fit together and use that as a building block to work out how the rest of everything else is going to go together. One of the other problems I've discovered by fiddling around with this dryly fit, just sort of held together arrangement, is that the length of the valve section here must be greater with Thayer valves than on rotary valves, because the tuning slide doesn't reach. This needs to be extended out about that much. So there's this much tuning slide shown on this side and there's absolutely nothing showing on the other side. The next thing is that it's quite clear that this part is canted over to my right, potentially because of the weird angle that this brace is on, which means that this is not fitting straight. Now I could solve both of these problems by moving this brace down, which would move this part up and changing the angle on the brace. I could potentially work around that issue that way, but I just don't know if that's the right thing to do or whether that's the correct thing to do. Of course, when this instrument was new and was getting assembled in the factory, they would have all sorts of jigs and other sorts of hokery-pokery stuff to hold the components of the instrument in perfect alignment so that they could just nip round and solder all the components together. I don't have that luxury. So with all that in mind, what I'm going to try to do is to just loosely solder some of these bits together so I can see how we get on. Just sort of trial and error fitting the instrument together. Right, well, between the last bit of video and this one, literally some time has passed, and I've made a little bit of progress. Some of the instrument is now actually connected up to each other, but I've got a couple of problems, one of which I'm hoping that you guys will be able to, that someone out there will be able to help me with. So what I've managed to do off camera is the most of the tubing for the F valve is now attached to the F valve, and same with most of the tubing for the G flat valve is likewise attached to the G flat valve. The bracing between the two loops of tubing on this side and over in here, I've got them soft soldered together. But that there is an inkling to the first problem that I've ran into, and that is you don't use soft solder for bracing. You can use soft solder to attach the tube to the flange of the brace, but where you've got a brace that is broken or snapped, as these braces have all done in the in its previous life, you're supposed to use silver solder to reattach them. Now that's a problem because I don't have high enough content silver solder, nor do I have something that will hold components at the temperature that you need to get them to be silver soldered properly. Soft solder melts at a couple of 100 degrees. Silver solder melts at about 3 times hotter. And I certainly do not want to be holding onto a piece of very hot brass when it goes past 600 or 700 degrees. So you're supposed to have a special jig to hold things. I don't have that, nor do I have the sort of manly grade of silver solder that you need, which is at least 35% silver. So I've ordered both of those things, but because I live in New Zealand where we don't have luxuries like high quality silver solder that's affordable and easily available on a Google search, I've had to order those things in from overseas, so that's going to potentially take a little while to arrive. The second problem that I've run into, and the thing that I'm hoping to get some assistance on, is that over here there is this weird sort of brace that goes, how's the best to show that, goes from the G flat valve through to what appears to be the main part of the bell section. Now it's still not thoroughly attached, it's just held in place by my hand at the moment, but that brace there is obviously very important. The trouble is that when I got the box of bits that contain these triggers, there didn't appear to be anything that would adequately explain how that brace forms a connection with the bell section. I'm guessing there's some sort of screw thread that's supposed to go over the end of that, because you'll need to unscrew that to disassemble the valves. I'm guessing that. So if anyone out there has a trombone that has 2 Thayer valves and it has this weird sort of brace that goes from the G flat loop of tubing through to the main bell section, if you could take a couple of photos showing me what that looks like and send that to me, that would be absolutely brilliant and would really help me out. The next little annoying thing that's happened is that the linkage that connects the second trigger to the actual second trigger has, I've lost it. I took it off and I put it on the bench right in front of me, but at some point over the past period of time it has fallen off that bench and gone into the floor. Now the floor of my garage is a very mystical and magical place where if something touches that floor, it's very unlikely that you'll ever see it again, and that certainly is what appears to have happened here. So I'm going to have to try and get a one of those linkages, which is a little bit annoying because again there's no chance of finding that in New Zealand. But I'm pleased to say that we're making a little bit of progress. Things are sort of starting to fit together. There's still quite a lot of work to do, but I'm hoping that once I've got things braced up properly and once I've completed the loops of tubing for the 2 triggers, I just need to get the tuning slides lined up and inserted, then I can actually see whether this instrument functions, whether the triggers on this are worth all the effort that I'm putting into it. I'm certainly hoping they are. But anyway, with this update, there's going to be a little bit of a hiatus on this project because I need to wait for bits to arrive. I'm sorry that there hasn't been much videoing of my soldering and the process that I've gone to assemble this, largely because I am very inept in that department and I don't really want 4,000 comments saying how useless I am, but also because there's just been a lot of trial and error trying to fit things together, seeing which things need to be adjusted, seeing which things can fit together naturally and all that sort of stuff. It has not been an easy process. But I thank you for sticking with me, and hopefully we'll see this instrument up and running shortly. Thanks for watching.